This is a University of Otago podcast.
Thank you for that introduction. I greet those people who were greeted by the chaplain. And the ones I remember were the Deputy Mayor of Dunedin, is that right? And the Vice-Chancellor, who's newly appointed. And I should, out of all due modesty, point out that this building is not named after me, but after him. And so it's also good to have someone as a Vice-Chancellor who comes from a decent academic discipline. If I could also say, I like the bit about selling the videos. It reminded me of the time I went at your expense to Northern Ireland. It was a long time ago, and I was a junior backbench member of Parliament. I'd been picked out for one of those trips by the British government designed to influence you. Half the Parliament will be over in the United States at the moment on freebies for the presidential campaign. The other half will be in Britain. And they will, we went there, and I decided to go one morning to see what the appeal of Ian Paisley was. So I went along to this absolutely extraordinarily intolerable service in the middle of a very strife-stricken place, where he called upon his country to stop marching to Rome with the communists. I always remember that line. It was a great line. It would seem to me to be unlikely to be happening in British-occupied Northern Ireland. And then we had a long closing prayer. And it seemed to last forever. And then it terminated without any rhyme or reason. And I found out why afterwards, because as soon as you got a signal on the pulpit that they'd finished duplicating the tape recordings of his sermon, so they could tell them at the door on the way out, he could stop the prayer. So there you are. Can I commend that course to the chaplain here tonight? So thank you for giving me this chance to talk to you. And I should tell you why I'm here. Some time ago, I was asked to speak here on the subject of peace. The organisers of the lecture, which included the Dunedin Jewish, Christian and Muslim community liaison group, asked if I would talk about the way in which respect and understanding among people of different faiths might lead to lasting peace on earth. I'm not the first to be asked to speak on such a subject, and I surely won't be the last. It's always been an issue, and for good reason. History is full of conflict between people of different faiths, and recent history is no different. There are too many recent examples of mass crime and genocide in which the participants have claimed a religious motive or have been identified by their religious faith or have used their religious faith to justify the most appalling atrocities. The Dunedin Community Liaison Group was formed after the terrible events of September the 11th, 2001. Since then, the relationship among people of different faiths have been tested over and over again. I'm going to speak tonight about a true test of human nature and human relationships. The invasion of Iraq is in every way an extraordinary event in international affairs. It is cause to think deeply about international relations and what those relations mean to us. It has a religious colouring which cannot be avoided. I would like to talk to you tonight about the many difficulties the invasion has created and the inability of international institutions to deal with them. Then we have to ask ourselves if there is any way in which people of goodwill can reach across the many divisions created by the crisis in international relations. I should tell you the point of view I bring to all of this. My values are the values of a secular society, where religious faith is a private matter and not the preserve of the state. Religious belief is almost universal amongst humanity. But in my view, the form it takes is the product of culture and society. In my view, is the product of my experience. I was brought up to see the church as an agent of change, as a creator of social reform. I belonged to the Methodist Church. And I grew up in an era when they were reformers, when I worked in London with Donald Soper, who kept getting arrested for having a go at Harold Wilson. And he was the most remarkable person to stand up for principle. The church was founded in opposition to some of the practices of the established church. It has in its time been the champion of the poor and the oppressed. It has a great deal in common with political movements in the West and was the product, in my view, of the same humanitarian and reforming impulses. If organised religion can be a force for good, it can equally be an agent of unfairness and injustice. Its teaching has been used to uphold power and privilege. Again, I find it impossible to separate forms of religious belief from the structure of the economic and social order. Where those structures are oppressive, organised religion will, in my view, be oppressive. If it is not oppressive, it will be revolutionary. One of the problems of being in government is that you don't like competition. It's a bit tough. And God provides a certain degree of competition to a prime minister or a leader of some description, and you feel the need to sort of outbid him or her. And so there is always the difficulty of whether you invoke the natural desire of people to be led, because there is something instinctive about human nature which leads people to turn to others, to look for the collective, and to seek the strength which they can't in their individual beings provide. And the research on leadership shows that despite all the academic denials about the intellectual assessment that people make about politicians, it is not necessarily the ability intellectually of a leader to capture the public commitment. It's the strength of their purpose. Margaret Thatcher could never be confused with an intellectual. She was and is in many ways barking mad. But she was absolutely to be revered because she provided that type of near divine, as it's seen by her supporters' leadership. And so you see this pattern. It is not peculiar to the people that we would regard as being of Mid-Eastern religions or older nations to follow those types of examples. We tend to be a bit hoity-toity about people that follow different religions and believe in people that we think are rather fraudulent. But you only have to look at the way that George Bush Jr. gets the absolute obeisance for his people. It is an instinct which 200 years of moving towards civilization hasn't stamped out of the American impulse. And it's still deeply rooted there. I know that many people don't see their faith in the way that I do. And I understand that my views of religious practice are at odds with the teaching of some forms of religious faith. I hope that in what I have to say tonight, I respect the difference. There is one more point I should make before I start. Although I was asked here to talk about peace. I am not what could be called a pacifist. That's to my shame. I work for people that spent years in prisons because they were. I worked for a man who was a pacifist, and he went to jail for 4 years, and when he came out, despite being a Master of Laws with first-class honours, he couldn't practice as a solicitor because he wouldn't take the oath, because if he took the oath, it meant that he would have to go and serve the Queen or King if they was called upon to do so. So he didn't swear the oath until after he'd passed the age for military service. Now that is a pacifist, and I am not one of them. But I think that individuals, societies, and nations have the right to defend themselves from attack. I think, for instance, that the government of Kuwait was entitled to call for military assistance when it was attacked, invaded by Iraq in 1990. I think that this country, New Zealand, was right to identify itself with the victims of aggression as it did in 1939 when it declared war on Germany. I am just as sure that there must be limits on the use of force. The use of force can only be justified if it is in proportion to the threat which is offered. Tomorrow is the anniversary of an attack which in my mind cannot be justified, and that is the bombing of Hiroshima. Like the bombing of Nagasaki, it was done to make a point, and the harm done was out of all proportion to the threat which by then had largely abated. I see no justification for the terrorist attacks of September 2001. They are a crime against humanity. The Bali bombing was no less an outrage. There is no justification for the murder of the innocent. The government of the United States and the government of Indonesia had a duty to pursue the people who were responsible for these terrorist crimes. The Indonesian government has had some success in bringing the murderers to account. The Americans had a harder task. It's the American response I'm going to talk about tonight. What the United States has done in response to the terrorist attacks is so remarkable and radical that it amounts to a revolution in international affairs. It is a revolution which has made the world a much more dangerous place. When it invaded Iraq, the United States set aside its military doctrine of containment and deterrence and adopted a radical new view of preventive war. It acted unilaterally and made it plain that multilateral processes were worth very little to it. It set aside all respect for national sovereignty and attempted to reconstruct Iraqi society by the use of military force. It showed contempt for the rules of international law, and from its position of overwhelming military might, it poured scorn on anyone who dared to object to the damage it has done to international institutions. Let's put it like this. Quote, from the outset, President George W. Bush adopted an overbearing approach to America's role in the world, relying upon military might and righteousness, insensitive to the concerns of traditional friends and allies, and disdainful of the United Nations. Instead of building upon America's great economic and moral strength to lead other nations in a coordinated campaign to address the causes of terrorism and stifle its resources, the administration, motivated more by ideology than by reasoned analysis, struck out on its own. It led the United States into an ill-planned and costly war from which exit is uncertain. Those are not my words. They are taken from a statement made less than 2 months ago by a group of retired American diplomats and senior military commanders. Now, there's a certain wistfulness about some American criticism of the Bush administration's foreign policy. Americans of all political opinions are used to seeing the United States as a benign influence in world affairs. The United States was, in this view, a nation which was distinguished by its idealism. It respected the rule of law. It helped build the international institutions which have been trampled over by the Bush administration. Among American critics of the Iraqi adventure, there is deep dismay that the foreign policy of the United States is now so widely seen as reckless and unprincipled. Now, there's no simple explanation of the Bush administration's actions. The administration told the American public that the invasion was part of what the president called the war on terror. It is not surprising that the Bush administration should respond to the terrorist attack by getting ready for war. Just after the attacks, public opinion in the United States might not have settled for much less. The cruelty of the attacks called out for a decisive response. The problem, of course, is that the enemy is not obvious, and the other problem is that you're satisfying an analysis of the situation which is motivated by superficiality, instinctive fear, and an absolutely undisciplined approach to threat analysis at the level of personal achievement, personal interest. I know the statistics for burglaries and murder and mayhem, and the chances of my being dealt to in any of those three categories twice in a week is extremely low. But there are many people in some parts of Auckland who believe it's going to happen every night. And that is part, of the human condition. So the United States government made its political response. The problem is the enemy is not obvious. The enemy is not a government which has declared war in the United States. The enemy is hidden. Its numbers can't be counted. Because its numbers can't be counted, its numbers are limitless. The war on terror can be won only when the United States believes that the invisible army of its enemies is no longer a threat. And that'll happen when the people of the United States stop believing that they are under an enormous, immediate, proximate threat. The war on terror, if it is characterized in the way that it is being dealt with now, is a war without end. Anyone who's travelled to the United States or done business with the United States will know the remarkable security measures which have been put in place. I have friends who live in a pleasant street in Washington which runs down to the Potomac River. Not long after the terror attacks, the riverbank became a building site, and very soon the end of the street was home to a gun emplacement. Security, they were New Zealanders. They were not there. It's like all these people looking after all the police surrounding the Prime Minister. Remember when Jenny Shipley, not Jenny Shipley, the other one with the tracksuit. When Ruth Richardson used to run down the terrace, she used to go jogging at lunchtime, and she'd always have 2 police officers with her. It's just amazing. And it took the general public 6 months to realise the cops were there for their protection. If you take steps such as that, you add to the uncertainty, and by placing the country on a war footing, they give weight to the view that war is inevitable. A continuing state of readiness for war does not in itself explain the invasion of Iraq. The invasion was not an attempt to bring justice to justice the people responsible for the terrorist attacks. Nobody in the United States administration could seriously claim that the regime in Iraq had had any direct involvement in those attacks. As we now know, there was never any evidence of Iraqi involvement. One American critic of the war compares the invasion of Iraq to the behaviour of the drunk who dropped his keys on one side of the street. He looked for them on the other side of the street because there was more light on that side. Iraq became a target, but not because the Iraqi regime had given comfort to the people who attacked the United States. In fact, the Bush administration had to work hard to find a justification for the invasion. It's hardly surprising. It's actually asking a lot for the world to believe that a country, a superpower like the United States, was in any way threatened by a country like Iraq. It's got the terrible problems of relativity, of perception of might and dominance, because there is that degree of fragility in the United States, having had their absolute inviolability ruptured by 2 terrorist or 3 terrorist attacks. The whole climate then changes and they become not inviolable, not violent, but at risk. Whereas countries who have no such history could never possibly work themselves into a lather like that. It's the most extraordinary mindset problem. The administration couldn't persuade the United Nations to give it a mandate for military action. According to the UN's weapon inspectors, the Iraqi regime made a reasonable effort to comply with the Security Council resolutions, but that made no difference. We kept hearing about the regime's weapons of mass destruction and the threat they pose to vital American and Allied interests. We now know that when the United States and its allies invaded, the Iraqi regime had no weapons which are capable of doing serious harm. We also know that as a result of inquiries held in Great Britain and the United States and the intelligence services of both countries, that their governments had been told that the weapons existed. The evidence was not conclusive. I don't suppose it ever is. Voters in the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia are entitled to be interested in the credibility of the evidence and in the credibility of the politicians who acted on the evidence. In terms of international law and international institutions, the existence of the weapons is not the critical point. Real or imagined, the weapons were used to justify what the Bush administration calls preventive war. It is a phrase which goes beyond rationality and well into absurdity. You cannot prevent a war by starting one. It is, by its very nature, oxymoronical to describe such a thing as a preventive war. It's sort of silly as Julie Bailey announcing the word news and saying that the local grammar school is taking preventative measures, presumably locking their teachers up with condoms. It's a silly sort of expression that they use, preventive war. If the authors of the doctrine actually believe in it, they're in the grip of an extraordinary delusion. If they don't, they have made a cynical attempt to provide some tattered justification for the unilateral exercise of military force. The new doctrine of preventive war has no standing in international law as it used to be understood. When it was put into practice in Iraq, there was no hiding what it was simply unprovoked aggression. Now we have to ask ourselves why the United States, the United Kingdom and Australia, 3 countries which publicly pride themselves on their democratic traditions, humanitarian values, and overtly embrace Christian ethos, should start war in such a doubtful cause. it's hard to find a convincing reason why a country like Australia should take part in an adventure which can't be justified legally or morally, and which serves no obvious Australian interest. The free trade deal with the United States, whatever it might actually be worth, and it doesn't seem like all that much, is a very low return for the loss of reputation Australia has suffered. To me, as an observer, there seems to be an emotional element in Australian identification with the United States and American interest. It is, in fact, part of the Australian psyche. We did a lot of research on it years ago when we were worrying about things like defence and war. And so we commissioned at your expense a polling. We had forum groups, and we found out interesting things. That we found out that New Zealanders looked for their lead not to the United States. It was just too far away. They looked to them for their Disneyland and films. They looked to Australia, and we paid someone to go to Australia and research it. We found out that in Australia, they didn't look to New Zealand. They looked exclusively to the United States. They regarded the United States as being the source of inspiration, leadership, and the moral conduit to eternity. I've offended some broadcasting. To me, it's the emotional element. It's the only real explanation that I can find for the Australian participation. When I heard the United Kingdom was going to invade Iraq, my reaction was to think that Tony Blair wanted to go down in history as a war leader. It is really quite odd. If you think back to the leaders of Britain that you've heard of and known, one of the greatest was a war leader, Churchill. He was the embodiment of the British resistance. He was everything. One day he was a field marshal, the next year he was an admiral, then he wore a fighter pilot's uniform. You couldn't have jammed him in the cockpit of a fighter plane. But he was the fellow that by that symbolism carried the British with him right through and took me to the point of that triumph over the threat. And of course the British then woke up and dumped him immediately and replaced him with a chap that could do the Times crossword puzzle on the tube. And built the National Health Service and was completely the reverse sort of person. But it is a timing thing and an emotional thing. And it shows the problem of the frailty of human nature and of people making responses in commitment to the individual lives and beings of people who are frail mortals who can't reserve to themselves the right to judge their future lives, put them to risks and to death. And there was, I think, in terms of our present British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, this extraordinary response. Is it because he is emotionally wanting to be that? Is it because he's naturally a teacher's pet? He has that sort of, first to go to the dental nurse type look about him. He has that sort of way with him. Anyhow, would he have been there? Let's do one conclusion. Britain wouldn't be anywhere near Iraq if it hadn't been for the Americans' invasion. That's one absolutely inescapable conclusion. And the answer to Iraq lies in what prompted the Americans to act the way that they did. Well, the easy explanation is oil. It has to be taken into account. The West's long-standing interest in that part of the world is driven by concern about the control of oil resources. The redevelopment of the Iraqi oil industry is in a benign political environment, if this proves possible, would have obvious benefits for Western energy consumers, and the Bush administration is close to oil interests. It's next to impossible for American policymakers to exclude oil from their strategic thinking, and American strategists have for a long time seen Iraq as a key to the stability of the region. I was lectured on that by a bouncer, the president of the Bouncers Union, that chap, Rick Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He's the weight pusher in the American administration. He goes around calling it order, along with Paul Wolfowitz, who under Reagan 20 years ago was leading the world to the rejection of Iraq, and they got their own way and they came back after all these years and they're running the show again. The strategists in the past have never chosen to set out on such a risky venture as the conquest of Iraq. And in fact, the funny thing was that the strategies of recent times, they didn't even take that chance when it was offered to them after Iraq invaded Kuwait. It was an extraordinary thing. It was the first President Bush who chose to leave the Iraqi regime in office. He gave a number of reasons for his choice. He didn't want to see the Iraqi state broken up. The human and political costs of conquering Iraq would be too great. American occupation of Iraq would alienate governments in the region. An occupation would have gone beyond the UN mandate, would have made a multilateral response to aggression less likely in future. And according to the first Bush administration, the best that could be hoped for in Iraq was a popular uprising which would trouble the region. Well, father was a wise old man in retrospect. He's only about 80 now, but he doesn't have a lot of influence. President George W. Bush has rejected his father's reasoning. There is extensive and convincing evidence that his administration saw Iraq as a potential target well before the terrorist attacks of 2001, and members of the administration wished to follow a more assertive policy in the region and make greater use of America's military power to promote America's interests. Those attacks created a climate in which the use of force became possible. In fact, it may have created a climate in which the use of force became inevitable. The response in the United States to the attacks was heartfelt patriotism. The country united behind the president. President Bush became the object of extraordinary popular enthusiasm. There was little tolerance for opinion which did not support the president, little room for critical examination of American policy at home or abroad. The demands of security were allowed at times, and still are allowed, to override civil liberties. Some elements of the news media were hardly more than cheerleaders for the administration. Political opposition was subdued. No leading Democrat spoke out against the invasion of Iraq until Howard Dean, whose chance at the Democratic nomination was snuffed out early in the primaries, decided to make an issue. And the funny thing was that the church was almost silent. It is an amazing phenomenon, the change that's taken place in the interaction between church and state in the last 15 years. I remember when church leaders were the ones who took governments on. Now church leaders are the ones that march with the government. And by acquiescence and servile acquiescence in some cases, they actually do nothing except advance the aspirations of megalomaniacs, be they of the invaders or the defenders. There was enormous sympathy for the United States in the wake of the attacks, but it melted away in face of the arrogance and overbearing righteousness of the response. Now, I've got a problem here because I can't help but use the word crusade. And that's not a good word to use in an audience like this, because several of you will have heard it used before. And in history, it has a very adverse resonance because of its identification with one side of a religious divide rather than the other. But I think about the word crusade and I think about the American invasion of Iraq. I mean by that to say the invasion was made possible by a popular belief in the justice of the American cause, which goes beyond reason and cannot be understood by those who do not share it, let alone by those who have been victims of it. Those who has been victims of it. And now my failed here has meant that I've turned the page completely and you've nearly been saved the speech. The new crusaders carry not a cross but a ballot box. Democracy is the name they give to their faith, and their battle cry is freedom. Opponents of the invasion who questioned the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were brushed off with the argument that the regime was evil and should be replaced by a democratic government. Now that the weapons are known not to exist, the replacement of the regime and the establishment of democracy in Iraq has been claimed as justification for the whole adventure. That argument is as spurious as any other justification for the invasion. There's no doubt that Iraq's regime was a brutal, murderous dictatorship. I went there at a time when the dictatorship was at its power, absolute peak, when he ran the show, and when we were met at the airport by Saddam Hussein lookalike, and he was much shorter. And we stayed in the Rashid Hotel, which gets bombed about every second day now. And the result was that we were cooped out there and not being able to do things and couldn't afford to eat because the cost of everything was prohibitive. A Coke was $20 US and all that sort of thing. And when we checked out, I went to pay the bill with great hesitation, and to my absolute dismay, they said, everything is compliments of the president. We could have been eating him. I never learned how to live off a dictator. It's terrible. That brutal regime was an appalling regime, and the people of Iraq would have been justified in rising up in revolution against it, but that's the point. The right of revolution belonged to the people of Iraq and not to anyone else, and no outsider has a right to impose a revolution on them. No outsider has a right to make a judgment about the risks they face and the costs they might have to carry. Those decisions belong to the people of Iraq and to nobody else. International law allows for uninvited outside intervention in very limited circumstances. There may be a humanitarian crisis of such a size that it demands a response. In such cases, the international community may decide that intervention is needed to resolve that crisis. The intervention must be no more than is needed to deal with the crisis. The United Nations had already imposed sanctions on Iraq in an attempt to limit the regime's murderous capabilities, and there was no justification in international law for any further action. To make the point that international law protected the Iraqi regime from outside intervention is not to be an apologist for Saddam Hussein. The law protects governments as we like as well as governments we don't like. If the law is broken, governments we like are as much at risk as governments we don't like. Something else has to be said. It's a lesson the United States has only begun to learn. There's almost no chance of the American invasion of Iraq having a happy ending. Iraq is unstable and close to ungovernable, and the lives of many Iraqis are a continuing tragedy. And if the American action has allowed the United States to rid itself of some of its enemies, it has created countless new ones. In Iraq, it has created an environment in which terrorism can flourish. In the region and around the world, the image of America as a nation to be feared rather than admired and respected has given new heart to terrorism. The most powerful nations have always been able to set aside the rights of smaller countries. It is a fact of power. It has happened many times. What is revolutionary here is not that the world's most powerful country has broken the rules. It has changed the rules, so it doesn't have to break them. What happens from now on is uncertain. In the short term, the American presidential election may make a difference. There's a chance, and only a chance, that the United States might maybe reconsider its position if a Democrat is elected, and none if the Bush administration stays in office. unlike the Prime Minister, I have a certain amount of freedom now, and I'm perfectly free to say that I hope George W. Bush sent back to his ranch as soon as possible. But she can't say that. She can't even drive past Waimate. And if you had Jim Sutton in the back seat, you'd want to get to Christchurch pretty quickly too. But I think that New Zealand is wise to tread carefully while the Bush administration is in office. But I don't see any real advantage for us in trying to appease the United States. We've got a group of army engineers in Iraq. They are there in the name of a dubious mandate from the United Nations, which was cobbled together to give the UN some appearance of relevance while letting the United States do exactly what it wanted. No good can come of the engineers being there. Their targets, their presence can't help but identify us with Iraqi's military occupiers. We have limited resources, and I doubt that they should be used for such a doubtful purpose. It's better for a country like New Zealand to seek the company of the like-minded and make our agreements which balance our interests with those of our chosen partners. We have entered an age of instability. International institutions are discredited. Since the end of the Cold War, the United Nations has stumbled from crisis to crisis. The authority of national governments is weakening as globalization makes it harder for governments to meet the expectations of voters. The West, after the invasion of Iraq, is divided and demoralized. As has happened at other times in history, when secular authority weakens, religious authority may take its place. Religion attracts not simply because of the reassuring qualities of religious belief. It may also attract because it reinforces traditional social structures. If it is conservative, it may offer a protection against the destructive change which has been imposed on many societies by outside agencies. As soon as it does that, it becomes a political force. Religion may be, as it often has been, a champion of economic and social good. It may be, as it often has been, a justification for brutality and aggression. And we have this eternal dilemma. Wherein might we be saved, irrespective of the genesis of our beliefs? And if there be in us all a conviction that we are not, in each of us, the ultimate extension of all perfect creation, and there be something which is given a name of, in some religions, God, and others, various forms of names, that there is to be found some movement towards that again, rather than to try and avoid that issue by looking to temporary palliatives in the form of passing governments or new political allegiances or new political voting systems or whatever. To go back to the core of the values of our life and our society, something which we use, I think, politics to escape from. One of the sad things about my life is, apart from being able at the age of 62 to pontificate for you tonight with increasing ease, as I've got the audience on the side and there's not going to be a civil war break out, is that you just simply, I don't know how to describe it properly, but you do overdo your omniscience. You overdo, as a politician, your answers. And the conflict between your need to be absolutely dependable, absolutely authoritative, and absolutely delivering to the people who trust and confide with you is extremely corrosive. It makes for a whole new centre of gravity of conviction and faith. And that is a very temporary locus when it's located in the politician or a passing political party. And the emergence of a faith of traditional conviction of any of the strands, which in some people's minds is not tenable because they don't believe in capital G God or whatever. It is to be met, I think, by the answer that we must respect the view of each other as to belief, but we need not believe in the ultimate detail of that which is believed by our fellow being. But we should acknowledge the process of the needs which got that person to that point and is able to be satisfied by the inclination of that person to have that faith and that trust. It is actually very important to have some form of faith and trust in someone who is not inherently mortal, because they tend to let you down. And so we look for people who are pretty close to immortal. And what the examples we've got in recent times, and Nelson Mandela, and Mahatma Gandhi, and people like that. I mean, I get on well with the Dalai Lama. We tell jokes to each other. My son talks to him in Hindi. It's good. But I don't necessarily believe that he is infallible. And I don't think that people ought to believe that quite a number of people are infallible. But I do understand how people can have faith that they are, and the basis of their faith and their conviction, without accepting the ultimate detail of their belief. And I certainly don't think we're at any entitlement at all to go to war, or to be violent, or to oppress, or suppress those who have a view of life and of the forces which create life with which we do not agree and we do not share a stream of dissent. And that's why it is so important that we talk and we don't get ourselves involved in an escalating justifications for brutality and aggression. Religious faith is again of worldwide significance. Terrorism has coloured the ideas of religious belief. Because of religious affiliations of terrorists, their religious belief is seen as a threat. The response to terrorism is in turn seen as an affront to religious belief. Religious belief therefore becomes a marker for intolerance and prejudice. I don't see faith itself as the issue. My view is that society shapes the form of religious belief and not the other way around. For all their religious colouring, I don't see what's happened in Iraq or what happens every day in Israel and Palestine, what happens in the minds of terrorism who kill the innocents in the name of their faith as matters of religion. I see them as political problems which need political solutions, and at their heart is a contest for resources. It's a contest carried out by the most extreme methods, the contest for resources in terms of land or territory, space or assets, a contest which is made more dangerous if the participants are seized, and made very bad if they're seized by a belief in the justice of their cause. There's nothing worse than someone who's self-righteously grabbing all the oil or grabbing all the gold in the river. And it's a belief in the error or indeed the evil of their opponents. The issues behind the contest will never be settled as long as the parties are consumed by righteousness. I don't suggest that faced with these appalling contests, people of religious faith should try to stand apart from politics. I don't see that as possible or desirable. Religious belief can't be separated from politics and from action in the political cause. People of religious belief have a critical part to play in resolutions of issues which have taken on a religious colouring. Where conflicts takes place between persons of different faiths, people who practice those faiths, and particularly people who lead in those faiths, should not allow followers of their faith to arm themselves with a false or misguided sense of religious purpose. And here I come to the question the organisers of the lecture asked me to answer, which is essentially how people of goodwill might make a difference. You've done very well. You're going to last this better than me, I think. People of goodwill might make a difference. My answer is short because in the end it's very simple. I think that all human beings have a duty to respect the rights of the beliefs of others. We should try to understand the faith of others, even though we have to acknowledge there are limits to our understanding. We may understand the outward forms of faith, although it is not always easy to do that. We may understand the impulse which leads to belief. I've had much stronger impulses which lead to belief. It's amazing how a diagnosis of an incurable condition can cause you to have a magnificent surge in religious belief. And I have recently had the joy of having a CD player given to me and a whole CD of Bach organ music, which I play until I'm dehydrated. And the tears will run down my cheeks with the majesty and magnificence, the sense of the absolutely wonderful nature of that music is just so moving. And I can understand how people get moved in ways which others would regard as completely irrational, but which is in the end absolutely sincere and matters of commitment. There's always something about faith which is quite beyond understanding. What matters is that we don't let our differences become a barrier between us. We must understand our own faith and be true to our beliefs. And I don't load that burden on those of religious faith alone. Secular society may be proud of its values, but quick to betray them when it suits. People who share those values and understand them should not let the betrayal go unmarked. People of faith should not be silent when that faith is misused to achieve political purposes. They should not allow the blessings of their faith to be bestowed on an unjust purpose. It matters when faith has become an issue that people of faith say very plainly what that faith is. One teaching is found in every religious faith. A great deal follows from it in the secular as well as the religious world. It is the rule of behaviour which tells us that we must treat other people the way that we'd like to be treated ourselves. And I commend all of you in the Dunedin Community Liaison Group for the practical effort you're making to live according to that rule. And I said at the beginning, the question you asked about peace have been asked forever. And that rule has always been the answer, and it's the only answer that I can give. Thank you.